So just to underline it, it will be voluntary. It won't be hell yes, we'll come get your guns.
No, it's not voluntary. I want to make sure that we make the distinction here. It is mandatory. It will be the law. You will be required to comply with the law.
Former Texas congressman this morning not mincing words when it comes to what an O'Rourke administration would look like for owners of assault weapons, clarifying one of the more memorable moments from last night. Here's that moment.
If it's a weapon that was designed to kill people on a battlefield, if the high impact, high velocity round, when it hits your body, shreds everything inside of your body because it was designed to do that so that you would bleed to death on a battlefield and not be able to get up and kill one of our soldiers. When we see that being used against children, and in Odessa, I met the mother of a 15-year-old girl who was shot by an AR-15, and that mother watched her bleed to death over the course of an hour because so many other people were shot by that AR-15 in Odessa and Midland. There weren't enough ambulances to get to them in time. Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore.
To many, that was the moment of the night. MSNBC's Garrett Haake is back with us from Houston, Texas. Garrett, you stand as a reporter in the middle of, I think, the two biggest stories right now. This sort of surge in public profile, Beto O'Rourke getting his groove back, and the tragedy of the mass shootings in Odessa and El Paso, Texas. What did you think personally when you saw that last night?
Look, I've spent the last 6 months on the road talking to these candidates and talking to Democratic primary voters. And while O'Rourke's comments last night scared some people, the sense I get is that he's squarely within the mainstream of what Democratic primary voters want to hear. You've got people who are literally chanting at politicians, do something. This is a very aggressive something. His answer on gun control doesn't get into the minutia of a filibuster of Senate rules. He doesn't name Mitch McConnell. He doesn't talk about a background check bill that was defeated 6 years ago. He said, we are going to do this in a very aggressive and earnestly heartfelt way. You cannot cover one of these shootings. I wasn't in El Paso, but I was in Odessa, and I've covered mass shootings before, and not be personally affected by it. It's clear that O'Rourke was, and that he seized on something that connects viscerally with the people who could potentially be electing him. You know, he has struggled to capture what he does well on the stump, on the debate stage, but last night, I think he sort of finally unlocked that and delivered that message in a way that resonated with a lot of people. You heard it in the room, and you've been hearing it all day on Twitter and on television from other folks who connected with it.
He absolutely struck a chord. I mean, I think that was sort of the emotional moment of the night. He has really found his voice in the wake of the El Paso shootings, a campaign that had really sort of been scuffling along until then. And he's found sort of a greater calling, a moral purpose for this. It was very powerful. Now, this cuts the other way, too. There is absolutely, this polling suggests Democrats and Republicans alike are in favor of some gun control measures, whether it's background checks or so on. And I think there is a real issue to ban these weapons of war, as he so vividly described them last night. Confiscating them is a different issue. And that's the kind of thing that the NRA and Second Amendment believers have long sort of feared, that would come, the conspiracy theories, the whispers about the government's coming to take your guns away. And in this case, he is giving voice to that conspiracy theory. Now, a lot of Americans would have no problem with that, but others would. And I think at the same time, as I heard from Republican strategists, as he was saying that last night, saying this could be the opening line of a Donald Trump re-election ad.
I don't know about that. Here's the front page of his hometown paper, El Paso newspaper, where coming back from a mass shooting in your community means that the debate that was on network television for more than 2 hours and in roadblock coverage on cable news doesn't make the front page. I mean, I think he's also giving voice to this story that dips in and out of the national news. But when it's your community, when it's your first graders who are slaughtered, it doesn't go away. And when it's someone, heaven forbid, that you love, it never goes away. And I think, look, I was in the government on 9/11, and the Patriot Act changed everything. Things that people said, oh, that'll never happen, that'll never happen. I think what the country is probably looking at is, has the clip, bad word, has the pace or the rate of mass shootings changed the policy debate around guns? And I don't know the answer, but I'm not sure that if I'm Donald Trump's campaign, I'm really going to go front and center about weapons of war being something we should keep available.
I totally agree. And now gun reform is kind of moving up in the polls as an issue that people truly, truly care about. Look, we have to understand, I'm thankful to Beto for doing that last night, because you have to understand, in Texas, just this summer, there were 2 mass shootings in one state just this summer. And I was just...
The second one carried out over the entire state.
That's exactly right. And so, and I was just thinking this morning, I got an email in my inbox about my 5-year-old just started school last week, and we got that email about there's going to be a lockdown drill next week. Talk to your kid. And it's about imminent threat. If something happens, this is what they should do. Go in a corner, stay silent. I mean, this is what parents are getting day after day, week after week, and this is really real for people. Schools are not safe. Schools are not safe. Malls are not safe. Theaters are not safe. Movies are not safe, right? If you go to a movie, it's not safe. And so it is a real issue. And so what we need now is a movement. And I think that's what Beto is trying to lean into. He's like, we need a movement. The Parkland students tried to do it with March for Our Lives, and they got a lot of young people out in 2018. We need to build, and we need a movement, because that's the only way we're going to see change. It's not going to happen in Washington, D.C. It's not. And if Donald Trump wants to use this as an issue, I think it's a bad move. I think it's a stupid.
Well, I think it's like
move.
Everything Trumpian. It cuts both ways. It cuts both ways.
It's about his base.
I want to say something else about Beto's candidacy. He's rebooted, I don't know, a couple times. Got a lot of criticism after he was on the cover of Vanity Fair or whatnot. O'Rourke seeks a reset if you're in your car, reaches out to National Democrats. It was the second reboot. He seems to have landed on a 3-legged stool that's going to hold him up for the foreseeable future in taking on white nationalism, which was sort of the intersection of the murderer in El Paso and Donald Trump's more racist rhetoric. This idea that the immigration policies of Donald Trump are cruel, but staking out a position more to the center of some other Democratic candidates in that presidential primary. And then on guns, speaking bluntly, swearing sometimes, saying to the media, why do you ask questions you know the answer to? I mean, he seems to be standing on a more solid base than at any other time in the presidential primary.
No, I absolutely think he has done that. And I think that even raising this about confiscating guns brings the issue dead center in the presidential race. And I agree the Parkland students and others had built this groundswell in the public, but it was not front and center in the Democratic primaries. Everybody was giving their regular, nice, statements about we need reform. He's hit it right on the head now, where it's going to have to be debated. I don't know that I'm all the way comfortable with how we're going to confiscate, because I'm worried about stop and frisk. I'm worried about the racial disparities when they start going to people's homes. But I want the debate. I thank him for bringing that on, and I think that is what lit up that crowd last night. And I think that is how you run for president. You've got to make it about more than you and more than your resume. And Beto's done that with that 3-legged stool that you're talking about, with gun reform,
the whole campaign staff are talking,
and immigration, and dealing with white supremacy and white nationalism. He has made his campaign more than about Beto. As long as it was Beto on the Vanity Fair cover, it was about him. When you represent something bigger than you, then people have to argue about that rather than you. And I think that's the mistake a lot of candidates make. They act as though they're in a beauty pageant rather than running to be the head of the free world and what that would look like if they win.
I want to get Garrett back in. He's got to go catch a plane. But you thought you had thoughts about Beto's performance.
Beto had the single most compelling moment of the night with that, and for 2 reasons. First, it was bold, and people like bold leadership. There's a reason Bernie Sanders' economic plan and Elizabeth Warren's economic plans resonate. It's because they're bold. Frankly, Donald Trump, when he stood on the debate stage and said, I don't know if I'll support these other yahoos, was bold. What we saw from Beto last night was bold leadership. And the second thing was he was shaping public opinion, not just following it. John Kennedy said we're going to the moon not because it's easy, because it's hard. Barack Obama said we're going to enact Obamacare even if it means we lose the House in 2 years. What Beto's saying is, What's happening in Washington, even with the hard work of House Democrats, is incrementalism, and it's not going to fundamentally change the culture of guns in the United States. Beto said, you know what? Everybody else go to hell. I'm going to fundamentally change the culture of guns on demand in the United States. Follow me, and I'll make it happen. Yep. A perfect moment for Beto.
You know, Garrett, this is where I wanted to end with you. I mean, and David said it better than I was going to in my sleep-deprived state. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth were viewed as outside the mainstream of the Democratic Party 2 years ago. Now they're two of the three frontrunners. In every big debate, it's been a voice from outside of Washington that's had the most impact on said debate in Washington.
Yeah, look, and I think O'Rourke might be a leading indicator on this. I'll tell you something that surprised me. I interviewed 4 of the candidates running to take on John Cornyn for the Texas Senate race. I interviewed them on Tuesday. 3 of them, 3 other Democrats, told me they support a mandatory buyback program. This is not like a suicide pact Texas policy here. This is something that other Democrats are willing to run on in the state where people own more guns than in any other state. And I did talk to O'Rourke a little bit about this last night, the how to get this done. He said, look, I'm counting on people to follow the law. This would be a buyback program, so people would have the opportunity to exchange these weapons for money. But there's not going to be a bunch of Austinite hipsters in black and white Beto t-shirts coming to your house to demand your gun back if you don't turn it over. There is no federal accounting for how many of these weapons even exist in circulation right now, but it would become an illegal item that you have in your home, just like machine guns are illegal even now. So, look, I don't think this is as politically risky as some have put it out to be. I think O'Rourke will happily trade a Second Amendment activist, if there's a theoretical Second Amendment activist out there still thinking about voting for him in a Democratic primary or general, for a suburban mom who doesn't want to get that email about their kid having to go through active shooter drills when they go back to school.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.